She had 11 million followers, and not one of them knew she was already dying. At 6:47 a.m., a cleaning woman named Marisol let herself into the Bel-Air mansion of beauty mogul Bianca Sterling, the way she did every Tuesday morning for the last 3 years. The gate code hadn't changed. The alarm wasn't set. That alone should have told her something was wrong, because Bianca Sterling never, ever forgot to set her alarm. She was the kind of woman who color-coded her skincare fridge and weighed her own gold leaf face masks before posting them. Control was her whole brand. Control was the only thing she trusted. Marisol found her floating in the infinity pool overlooking the canyon, her platinum hair fanned out around her like a halo, her signature crystal-studded robe soaked through and clinging to her like a second skin. The water, usually heated to a precise 84 degrees for her 5 a.m. wellness swims, had gone cold. Bianca Sterling, 29 years old, the woman who taught 14 million people how to contour a jawline and fake a glow, was dead. And within 6 hours, the story the world would be told, tragic accident, exhausted star, slipped and drowned, would already be a lie. Because Bianca Sterling didn't drown. Somebody held her under. And by the end of this story, you're going to realize that almost everyone who loved her had a reason to want her gone: her fiancé, her best friend, her own sister, the business partner who built an empire on her face. One of them is a killer. All of them are liars. And the woman in that water knew secrets so dangerous, they were never going to let her live long enough to post them. This is Blush and Blood. And this is the story of the girl behind the filter. Before there was a mansion, before there was a pool, before there were 11 million strangers who thought they knew her, there was just a girl named Bianca Kowalski from a flat, gray stretch of Ohio nobody photographs for postcards. She wasn't born into money. She wasn't born beautiful in the way the world later insisted she was, that came later, sculpted slowly over years of contouring tutorials and, eventually, a very discreet trip to a clinic in Beverly Hills that she would deny to her dying day. What she was born with was hunger. A specific, gnawing kind of hunger that only people who grew up watching their mothers count exact change at the grocery store really understand. She started posting makeup videos at 16, filmed on a cracked iPhone propped against a stack of textbooks in her childhood bedroom, the wallpaper behind her peeling at the corners. Nobody watched. For 2 years, nobody watched. She uploaded into silence the way some people pray into silence, out of stubbornness, out of faith that someone, somewhere, was eventually going to answer. And then, at 18, something cracked open. A 50-second video of her transforming a $5 drugstore pallet into something that looked like it belonged on a runway went viral overnight, and Bianca Kowalski became, almost instantly, somebody else. By 20, she had 1 million followers and a new last name, Sterling, a name she'd picked herself off a jewelry box in a thrift store, because, she said later in interviews, Kowalski didn't sound like someone people send PayPal money to. By 23, she had her own line of products, Sterling Glow, and a face so recognizable that strangers cried when they met her at meet and greets, the way people cry when they meet a saint, or a ghost. By 26, she had the mansion in Bel-Air, the one with the pool, the one where she would, 3 years later, be found dead in the water she'd paid extra to have heated. It is important, before we go any further, that you understand something about Bianca Sterling that almost nobody outside her inner circle knew. She was exhausted. Not tired the way a normal person gets tired, bone deep, hollowed out exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from spending a decade being something for other people to look at. She had not had an unfiltered photo taken of her in 4 years. She had not eaten a full meal in front of another human being in longer than that. Behind the elegant captions and the soft focus videos of her sipping green juice on her terrace, Bianca Sterling was quietly, methodically, falling apart, and somebody in her life knew it, and somebody in her life decided to use it. Detective Maya Torres of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department had worked exactly 4 celebrity deaths in her 15 years on the force, and every single one of them had taught her the same brutal lesson: the bigger the audience, the bigger the lie. She arrived at the Sterling estate at 7:52 a.m., before the coroner, before the press helicopters that would, within the hour, start circling the canyon like vultures who'd already smelled the story. The pool house alone was bigger than the house Torres grew up in. She stood at the edge of the water for a long moment before she let the crime scene techs move in, just looking at Bianca Sterling's face, still, somehow, perfectly contoured, her false lashes intact, not a smudge of mascara out of place, as if death itself had been too intimidated to mess up her makeup. That detail bothered Torres more than almost anything else at the scene. People who drown accidentally do not look like they're posing for a magazine cover. People who drown accidentally fight. They claw at the water, they panic, they smear their own faces in their last desperate seconds of life. Bianca Sterling looked like she'd been arranged. The first officer on scene had already started calling it an accident, exhausted celebrity, too many pills, late-night swim gone wrong, case closed before lunch. Torres had seen enough of these cases to know that exhausted celebrity was the explanation the world wanted to hear, because it was easy, because it didn't ask anyone to look any closer at the people standing just outside the police tape, dabbing carefully at dry eyes, waiting to inherit what was left. And there were a lot of people standing outside the tape. There was Jordan Cole, Bianca's fiancé of 14 months, a former personal trainer with a jaw like a Roman statue and eyes that, Torres noted, kept drifting toward his phone even as he wept. There was Felix Marsh, Bianca's business manager and the CEO of Sterling Glow's parent company, a man in a $5,000 suit who looked less like he was grieving and more like he was already calculating quarterly losses. There was Dahlia Sterling, no, Dahlia Kowalski, Bianca's younger sister, who had quietly changed her own last name back the moment the cameras started rolling, as if she wanted the world to know, even now, that she had never been given the Sterling name to begin with. And there was Priya Anand, Bianca's longtime makeup artist and self-described best friend, sobbing into a Chanel scarf that Torres would later learn had been a gift from Bianca herself, just 6 days before she died. 4 people. 4 alibis that, on the surface, all seemed to check out. And one dead woman whose body was already telling Detective Torres a very different story than the one everyone wanted her to believe. The preliminary autopsy came back 41 hours later, and it took exactly 1 sentence to turn an accidental drowning into a homicide investigation. The medical examiner, a meticulous, soft-spoken woman named Dr. Elaine Whitfield, called Torres directly instead of routing it through the usual channels, which was, in itself, a signal that something was wrong. "There are bruises on her shoulders," Dr. Whitfield said. "Fresh ones. Finger-shaped. Someone held her down." It got worse from there. Bianca Sterling's bloodstream contained a significant dose of a sedative called zolpidem, far more than her prescribed sleep medication would have given her, and far more than would have been needed for sleep alone. Combined with the water in her lungs and the bruising on her shoulders, Dr. Whitfield's conclusion was clinical, careful, and devastating. Bianca Sterling had been drugged into helplessness, and then someone had held her face beneath the surface of her own heated infinity pool until she stopped breathing. This was not an accident. This was not a tragic mistake by an overworked star who'd had 1 drink too many. This was murder, dressed up to look like grief. Torres sat with that information for a long time before she made her next move, because she understood something that most people, watching this story unfold on their phones over the following weeks, would not fully grasp until much later. Someone close to Bianca Sterling, someone who had access to her home, her routine, her pills, her trust, had planned this. Carefully. Patiently. The kind of patience that comes from having watched someone for a very long time and waiting for exactly the right night. And the unsettling truth, the one that made the hair stand up on the back of Torres's neck as she reviewed the guest list from Bianca's final night alive, was this: every single person who had been at that mansion the evening before her death had a key to the gate. Every single one of them knew the alarm code. Every single one of them knew, better than any stranger ever could, exactly how to make Bianca Sterling's death look like something it wasn't. Jordan Cole met Bianca Sterling at a juice bar in Malibu 18 months before her death, in a meeting that her publicist would later describe, breathlessly, as fate. He had been a personal trainer to minor celebrities for 6 years, mostly forgettable men in finance who wanted six-pack abs for their 30th birthdays, and Bianca Sterling, when she walked through that door in oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap, had looked at him the way nobody had looked at him in years, like he mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with what he could do for a career. Within 3 months, he had moved into the Bel-Air mansion. Within 9, there was a ring, a 4-carat emerald-cut diamond that Bianca had, in fact, purchased herself, a detail that very few people outside her accountant knew, and a detail that would matter enormously once Detective Torres started pulling financial records. Because here is the thing about Jordan Cole that the tabloids never quite managed to dig up before the murder, but that Torres uncovered within 4 days of opening her investigation. He was, by any reasonable measure, broke. Not struggling, broke. He owed back taxes from his training business. He had 3 credit cards maxed to their limits. He had, 6 weeks before Bianca's death, quietly applied for a personal loan using the Bel-Air mansion's address as collateral, an act so brazen it bordered on fraud, since the house wasn't his and never had been. And there was something else. Something Torres found when she finally got a warrant for his phone records, a string of late-night messages, deleted from Jordan's main inbox but recovered from a cloud backup he hadn't thought to clear, sent to a number that did not belong to Bianca Sterling. The messages were warm, intimate, familiar in a way that engaged men do not get to be with women who are not their fiancés. The number belonged to Priya Anand, Bianca's best friend, Bianca's makeup artist, the woman sobbing into a Chanel scarf at the crime scene. Torres read through 11 months of messages between Jordan Cole and Priya Anand and felt something cold settle in her stomach, because buried in a message sent just 4 days before Bianca died, Jordan had written something that read less like a secret romance and more like a plan. After the wedding it'll be easier. Once everything's combined we just need patience. Combined. As in finances. As in the prenup Bianca had been refusing to sign for months, the one her lawyer had finally convinced her to draft just 2 weeks before her death, a prenup that would have left Jordan with almost nothing if the engagement ever ended. The wedding was scheduled for 6 weeks after Bianca died. If she had lived long enough to walk down that aisle without a signed prenup, Jordan Cole would have become, instantly, one of the wealthiest men in Los Angeles the moment vows were exchanged, wealthier still, in fact, the moment she died, since as her fiancé and listed emergency contact, certain joint accounts and the engagement gifts would transfer automatically. A man drowning in debt. A secret lover inside the victim's own inner circle. A financial motive so clean it could have been written by a screenwriter. It was, Torres knew, exactly the kind of motive that made for a satisfying answer. Which was precisely why she didn't trust it yet. In her experience, the cases that solved themselves this neatly in week 1 almost never held up by week 4. Priya Anand had been doing Bianca Sterling's makeup since before Bianca Sterling was anybody, since the cracked iPhone, peeling wallpaper days in Ohio, when Priya was a cosmetology student renting a chair at a strip mall salon and Bianca would drive 40 minutes each way just to have someone who actually understood color theory touch her face. They had grown up together, in the way that matters more than blood sometimes does. Priya had been there for the first viral video, the first sponsorship deal, the first time Bianca cried in a hotel bathroom because a tabloid had called her manufactured, and she didn't know how to argue with the truth of it. For 9 years, Priya Anand was the only person allowed to see Bianca Sterling without her face on. She knew about the eating or the not eating. She knew about the panic attacks before red carpet events, the ones Bianca hid by locking herself in bathrooms and breathing into paper bags between camera flashes. She knew, in other words, everything, which made her either the person least likely to want Bianca dead, or the person most dangerous to her, depending entirely on what kind of love theirs actually was underneath the surface. When Torres sat Priya down for a formal interview 5 days after the murder, the makeup artist's hands shook so violently she could barely hold her coffee cup, and at first, Torres read it as grief. It took almost 40 minutes of careful, patient questioning before Torres understood it was something else. Guilt has a different shake to it than grief. Grief trembles from the chest outward. Guilt trembles from the hands first, like the body is trying to confess something the mouth refuses to say. "How long have you been involved with Jordan?" Torres finally asked, watching Priya's face carefully. The coffee cup hit the table hard enough to crack. What came out over the next hour was a story that Priya had clearly been carrying alone for almost a year, the way people carry things that are too heavy and too shameful to put down anywhere safe. It had started, she said, almost by accident, long nights on set, Bianca asleep early from exhaustion or sedatives, Jordan and Priya the only 2 people left awake in a mansion that felt, by then, more like a beautifully decorated prison than a home. It had not started as betrayal, Priya insisted, voice cracking. It had started as two lonely people keeping each other company in the wreckage of someone else's golden life. But it had not stayed innocent. And here was the detail that made Torres's pulse quicken. Priya admitted, through tears, that she had been the one supplying Bianca's sleep medication for the last 8 months, not illegally, not maliciously, she insisted, just picking up the prescriptions because Bianca's schedule never allowed for pharmacy runs, because that's what best friends did. Which meant Priya Anand had access. Priya Anand knew the dosage. Priya Anand could, with very little effort, have adjusted what went into that prescription bottle without anyone, including Bianca, ever noticing the difference. Priya swore she hadn't. She swore, sobbing, that she loved Bianca more than she had ever loved anyone, including Jordan, including herself, and that the affair had been the worst, most poisonous thing she had ever done, but that she would never, never have hurt her. Torres watched her carefully and noted, in her file, a single line, * motive present. Means present. Alibi unconfirmed for the critical window between 2 and 4 a.m. Continue surveillance, *. It was not a confession. But it was not innocence, either. And the deeper Torres dug, the more she suspected that the affair between Jordan and Priya was not the darkest secret hiding inside that mansion, it was simply the first one to surface. Dalia Kowalski was 26 years old, 4 years younger than Bianca, and had spent her entire adult life standing in a shadow that grew longer every single year. She did not have a verified account. She did not have a fragrance line or a Sephora end cap with her face on it. What she had was a small apartment in North Hollywood, a part-time job at a wine bar, and a relationship with her famous sister that, to anyone watching from the outside, in the carefully staged Instagram photos Bianca occasionally posted of the two of them, looked like love, but which Dalia would later describe to Detective Torres, in a quiet, flat voice, as something closer to being employed as a sister. For years, Bianca had paid Dalia's rent, in exchange for what amounted to a kind of unofficial, unpaid assistant role, running errands, ghostwriting captions, showing up at events as photogenic proof that Bianca Sterling, self-made glow-up icon, still had family, still had roots, still had a heart underneath the highlighter. It had started, Dalia said, as genuine generosity. It had ended, slowly, as something that felt a great deal more like ownership. 6 weeks before her death, Bianca had cut Dalia off entirely, stopped the monthly rent payments, removed her as an authorized assistant on the company accounts, and, in a detail that Torres found almost unbearably sad once she learned the full context, deleted Dalia from the family trust she had quietly drawn up 2 years earlier. The reason, according to texts Torres pulled from Bianca's own phone, was an argument that had spiraled out of control over something that, on its surface, seemed almost trivial. Dalia had leaked an unfiltered, unedited photo of Bianca to a tabloid blog, one taken during a private family dinner, showing the version of her sister's face that 10 years and an empire of cosmetics had been built to hide forever. Bianca's text to her sister, sent the night the photo leaked, read simply, "You sold the one thing I never let anyone have." They had not spoken since. Which meant that on the night Bianca Sterling died, her younger sister, cut off financially, removed from the family trust, 6 weeks into a silence neither of them had broken, had absolutely no reason to be anywhere near that mansion. Except for one detail that nearly stopped Torres's heart when she found it buried in the security footage logs, Dalia's gate code had been used at 1:14 a.m. on the night of the murder. The system showed entry. It did not show exit. When Torres asked Dalia about it directly, the younger sister's face went the color of chalk, and what she said next opened up a door that Torres had not even known existed. "I went there to apologize," Dalia whispered. "I went there to fix it. And when I let myself in, the front door was already open. And there was someone else's car in the back drive that I didn't recognize. Of every person standing outside the police tape on the morning Bianca Sterling's body was pulled from the water, Felix Marsh had the most to lose, and, Torres would come to learn, the most to hide. Felix had discovered Bianca, in a sense, before the world had. He'd been a junior marketing executive at a struggling cosmetics startup when he'd spotted her early videos and convinced his bosses to sign her to an exclusive licensing deal that, within 3 years, would make him the CEO of what became Sterling Glow's parent company, and would make Bianca, on paper at least, one of the wealthiest self-made women in America. The arrangement between them had always been complicated in ways the public never saw. Bianca owned her name and her image. Felix's company owned the formulas, the manufacturing, the distribution, meaning that without Felix, Bianca Sterling had a face and a following but no actual product to sell, and without Bianca, Felix had warehouses full of foundation and serum with nobody's name worth printing on the label. It was a marriage of mutual dependency dressed up as a business partnership, and like a lot of marriages, it had quietly curdled into something resentful long before anyone outside the boardroom noticed. Torres pulled the financial records for Sterling Glow's parent company 8 days into her investigation, expecting, at most, some unflattering details about executive bonuses or inflated expense accounts. What she found instead was the kind of fraud that takes years to build and seconds to unravel once the right person starts asking the right questions. Felix Marsh had been quietly siphoning company funds into a shell entity registered in Delaware for the better part of 3 years, using inflated manufacturing invoices to cover the gap, to the tune of just over $12 million. It was, on its own, a financial crime, serious, prosecutable, but not, by itself, a murder motive. What turned it into one was a single email, recovered from a deleted folder on Bianca's personal laptop, dated 9 days before her death, sent from Bianca directly to her lawyer with the subject line, *I think Felix is stealing from me. I want a forensic audit before the IPO announcement, The IPO, the public stock offering that would have taken Sterling Glow from a private licensing deal to a publicly traded company worth, by some estimates, north of $400 million, was scheduled to be announced exactly 12 days after Bianca's death. A forensic audit, conducted in the weeks before that announcement, would not only have exposed Felix Marsh's embezzlement, it would have collapsed the entire IPO, destroyed the company's valuation, triggered shareholder lawsuits, and almost certainly ended with Felix Marsh facing federal fraud charges severe enough to put him away for the rest of his working life. Bianca Sterling died 9 days after sending that email. Torres sat with that fact for a long time, because in 15 years of homicide work, she had learned that very few motives were purer, or more dangerous, than a man watching everything he built, and everything he'd stolen, about to be taken away from him by the one person who actually had the power to do it. The party at the Sterling mansion the evening before Bianca's death had been small, intimate by her usual standards, no press, no influencer guest list, just the 4 people who would later stand outside the police tape, gathered to celebrate, in theory, the upcoming wedding. Torres reconstructed the timeline with the kind of obsessive patience that had made her one of the best closers in the department, cross-referencing security footage, phone pings, and 4 wildly inconsistent witness statements until a shape finally began to emerge from the fog. At 9:40 p.m., security footage showed all 4 guests still present on the back terrace, Jordan pouring champagne, Priya laughing at something on her phone, Felix on a call he stepped away to take, Dahlia notably absent from the footage entirely, having not yet arrived. At 10:55 p.m., Bianca was recorded on her own phone's health app taking her evening sleep medication, the dosage logged automatically through a connected app her doctor had set up to monitor her insomnia, a detail that would prove crucial, because it showed the exact, correct, prescribed dose. Whatever lethal amount eventually entered her system, it had not come from the 10:55 p.m. dose. By 11:30 p.m., the footage showed Felix Marsh leaving the property, or, more precisely, showed his car leaving the property, since a later, far more thorough review of the footage revealed that the car's interior lighting suggested no driver was visible behind the wheel during the brief 2 seconds the gate camera caught it passing through. A detail Torres flagged immediately, and one that would not make sense until much later. At 12:15 a.m., Priya Anand left as well, her departure confirmed both by gate footage and by a phone call she made from her own car 11 minutes later, placing her clearly off the property. Jordan Cole's exit was never captured on camera at all. The system showed no gate activity for his code that night after his arrival, meaning that, according to the mansion's own security records, Jordan Cole never left. And then, at 1:14 a.m., Dahlia's gate code triggered an entry that was never matched by a corresponding exit. Which meant that in the final hours of Bianca Sterling's life, the mansion's own logs placed at least 2 people inside that house long after the party should have ended, her fiancé, who supposedly never left, and her estranged sister, who arrived in secret well past midnight to apologize to someone who, by Dahlia's own account, was already gone by the time she let herself in. The front door was open, Dahlia had said. And there was a car in the back I didn't recognize. Torres pulled every registered vehicle associated with everyone in Bianca Sterling's orbit. None of them matched the make Dahlia described. Which meant someone else, a fifth person, someone outside the four primary suspects, had been on that property the night Bianca Sterling died, and so far, nobody had said a single word about who that might be. 11 days into the investigation, working through Bianca's phone records for what felt like the 100th time, Torres found something everyone before her had missed, not because it was hidden, but because it had been misfiled under a contact name that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't done the research Torres had spent the last 2 weeks doing. A voicemail, 3 minutes and 40 seconds long, left on Bianca's phone at 11:58 p.m. the night she died, from a contact saved simply as "Don't answer." Torres played it in her car in the parking garage beneath the sheriff's station, alone, twice, before she trusted herself to type up the transcript. The voice on the recording was a man's, calm in a way that felt deliberately, almost theatrically controlled, the kind of calm that takes real effort to maintain. "You should have just signed the audit waiver, Bianca," the voice said. "You should have let it go. I built this with you. I built this for you. And you were going to let some lawyer take it all apart because you got a guilty conscience at 29. I'm not going to let you do that. Not to me, not to the company, not after everything I sacrificed. I just need you to understand that before tonight is over." It was Felix Marsh's voice. Torres was almost certain of it within the first 10 seconds, and a voice analysis confirmed it within 48 hours. A voicemail, left less than 3 hours before Bianca Sterling died, in which her business partner, the man with $12 million in stolen funds and an IPO that depended entirely on her silence, explicitly referenced the forensic audit that would have ended his career, his freedom, and his fortune, and explicitly told her he was not going to let her go through with it. It read, on its face, like a confession. It was the kind of evidence that closes cases, the kind that prosecutors dream about, the kind that would have, in a tidier story, ended this entire investigation right there with handcuffs and a press conference. Except Torres had learned, over 15 years, that the universe rarely hands a detective exactly what she needs without also handing her a reason to doubt it. Because when she cross-referenced the voicemail's timestamp against Felix Marsh's cell tower data, his phone had been pinging off a tower in Santa Monica, 11 miles from the Bel-Air mansion, at the exact moment that voicemail was recorded. Felix Marsh could not have left that message from his own phone at that location and also been inside the mansion threatening Bianca Sterling in person. Which meant either the voicemail was recorded somewhere else and sent later, entirely possible with modern phones, or someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it sound like Felix Marsh had said something he never actually said. While Torres worked the voicemail, the forensic accounting team finally finished combing through the financial wreckage of Sterling Glow, and what they found reframed the entire case in a way that nobody, least of all the public, who had already decided, based on tabloid leaks, that Jordan Cole was guilty, was prepared for. Bianca Sterling had not requested the forensic audit out of pure moral conviction, the way her email to her lawyer had implied. She had requested it because she'd discovered something about her own company's flagship product that terrified her far more than any business scandal ever could. Sterling Glow's best-selling item, a luminous, viral, miracle serum responsible for nearly 40% of the brand's annual revenue, had quietly been linked, over the preceding 8 months, to a cluster of serious allergic reactions in customers, 3 of which had resulted in hospitalization, one of which, a 31-year-old mother of 2 in Tampa, had resulted in permanent scarring. Bianca had found out not through any official channel, but through a string of increasingly desperate, increasingly heartbreaking messages sent to her personal account by the injured customers themselves, women who trusted her, who believed in the face behind the product, who had no idea that the woman they were begging for help was, at that very moment, drowning in a different kind of guilt entirely. Bianca had forwarded those messages to Felix Marsh and demanded the product be pulled from shelves immediately. Felix, with the IPO 12 days away and the serum representing nearly half the company's projected valuation, had refused. That refusal, not the embezzlement alone, though that was real too, was what had finally pushed Bianca toward the forensic audit. She hadn't just discovered Felix was stealing money. She had discovered he was knowingly selling a product that was hurting people, and hiding it, and she had decided, in the final 2 weeks of her life, that she was finally, after a decade of building a kingdom out of curated perfection, going to tell the truth. She had drafted, but never posted, a video. Torres found it in Bianca's cloud storage, unedited, raw, recorded alone in her bathroom at 2 in the morning 8 days before she died. No makeup, no ring light, no filter, the first unfiltered footage of Bianca Sterling that had existed in over 4 years. In it, she looked directly into the camera, her face pale and tired and, for the first time in the entire investigation, completely, devastatingly human, and said, "I have spent 10 years selling you a version of myself that doesn't exist, and I am about to tell you something that's going to cost me everything I built to get you here. But there are women who got hurt because of a product I put my name on, and I am done being complicit in my own lie." She never posted it. She died 8 days later, with that confession still sitting, unfinished, in a folder labeled, "Draft, Do Not Delete." With the financial motive now sharper and more dangerous than ever, Torres turned her full attention back to that fifth, unidentified vehicle Dahlia claimed to have seen parked in the back drive of the mansion sometime after 1 in the morning. Dahlia, under hypnosis-assisted recall conducted with a court-approved forensic psychologist, was eventually able to recall 2 details she hadn't initially mentioned. The car had been a dark sedan, and it had a small, distinctive parking permit sticker on the windshield, the kind issued by corporate office buildings for employee parking. It took Torres's team 4 days to trace that single detail to its source, a numbered parking permit issued to employees of a private security and reputation management firm based in Culver City, a firm that, when Torres pulled their client list under subpoena, had been retained 11 months earlier by none other than Sterling Glow's parent company, hired, according to the contract, for executive protection and discrete asset monitoring. In plain language, Felix Marsh had hired private investigators to watch Bianca Sterling. Not protect her. Watch her. When confronted, Felix's lawyer initially tried to frame the arrangement as standard corporate due diligence ahead of a major IPO, background monitoring, nothing sinister. But the deeper Torres dug into the surveillance firm's internal records, recovered through a painstaking subpoena process that took nearly 3 weeks, the uglier the truth became. Felix hadn't hired them to monitor market risk. He'd hired them, specifically, to monitor Bianca herself, her phone usage, her private meetings with lawyers, her communications with the injured customers from the serum scandal, because he'd suspected, correctly, that she was building a case against him long before that forensic audit email ever reached her lawyer's inbox. And on the night Bianca Sterling died, the surveillance firm's own internal logs showed a contractor named Russell Pike dispatched to the Bel-Air property at 11:40 p.m., with instructions, typed plainly into the company's case management software by Felix Marsh's personal assistant, to confirm she has not removed physical files from the residence. Russell Pike was the 5th person at that mansion. And Russell Pike, it would turn out, was far more than a hired set of eyes. Russell Pike was 44 years old, a former LAPD officer who'd left the force 8 years earlier under circumstances that Torres, with some difficulty, eventually uncovered, a use-of-force complaint that had been quietly settled before it ever reached a public hearing, the kind of settlement that ends a career without ever technically ending it on paper. Since leaving the department, he had built a career in exactly the kind of shadow industry that exists at the intersection of wealth and paranoia, private security, corporate surveillance, the quiet, well-paid work of watching people who don't know they're being watched. When Torres finally brought him in for questioning, 17 days into the investigation, Russell Pike did something that almost nobody else in this case had done. He didn't cry, he didn't perform grief, he didn't reach for a lawyer in the first 5 minutes. He sat very still, very calm, and waited for Torres to ask her first question, the way a man waits when he has already decided, long before walking through the door, exactly how much he is and isn't going to say. He admitted, readily, that he had been dispatched to the Sterling mansion on Felix Marsh's orders that night. He admitted he had entered the property using a gate code Felix had supplied him weeks earlier, a code that, Torres realized with a jolt, Felix must have obtained surreptitiously, possibly from the same surveillance operation, since Bianca had certainly never given her business partner her private gate code. He admitted he had let himself in through a side entrance near the pool house at approximately 12:50 a.m., well after both Priya and Felix's car had left the property and shortly before Dahlia's own gate code entry. What he denied, flatly and without hesitation, was killing her. "She was already in the pool when I got there," Pike said. "I thought she was swimming at first. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized she wasn't moving." According to Pike, he panicked, not out of any affection for Bianca Sterling, whom he'd never personally met before that night, but out of the sudden, dawning understanding that he was a disgraced ex-cop with a history of misconduct, illegally trespassing on a dead celebrity's property in the middle of the night on the orders of a man he was now certain had set him up to take the fall. He claimed he checked for a pulse, found none, and fled the property without calling 911, a decision he admitted, with what seemed like genuine, late-arriving shame, was the worst thing he had ever done, but one he insisted was born from fear, not guilt over her death. "If I called it in," he said, "I'm the last person who saw her alive. I'm an ex-cop with a use of force complaint, trespassing at a dead woman's mansion at 1 in the morning. Nobody was going to believe I just found her like that." It was, Torres had to admit, not an unreasonable fear. But it left an enormous, gaping hole in the timeline that someone still had to fill. If Bianca Sterling was already in the pool, already dead or dying, at 12:50 a.m. when Pike arrived, and if her own gate logs showed Felix's car leaving at 11:30 and Priya's departure confirmed at 12:15, then the window for the actual murder had narrowed down to a window so small it pointed, with increasing and uncomfortable clarity, toward exactly one person. Jordan Cole, whose exit the gate system had never recorded that night at all. Torres brought Jordan Cole in for what would become the longest interrogation of the entire case, 18 hours spread across 2 days, and watched a man who had spent 18 months performing devotion slowly, methodically, run out of road. For the first 6 hours, Jordan stuck to his original story without deviation. He had gone to bed around midnight, alone, while Bianca stayed up finishing some work on her laptop, and he had not woken up until the screaming started the next morning when Marisol found the body. It was a clean story, a simple story, and it had one enormous problem, which Torres laid out for him with the patient cruelty of someone who has done this 1,000 times. The gate system showed he never left, which fit his story, but the bedroom's smart thermostat, a detail almost nobody thinks about, a detail that logs motion-activated temperature adjustments with exact timestamps, showed the master bedroom had registered zero motion activity between 11:50 p.m. and 6:30 a.m. the next morning. If Jordan Cole had genuinely gone to sleep in that bedroom at midnight, the thermostat would have logged the small, constant motion of a sleeping body shifting, breathing, rolling over, the way human bodies do even in deep sleep. It logged nothing. Which meant, in the simplest terms, that Jordan Cole had not been in that bedroom at all during the hours his fiancée was dying 40 yards away in the pool. It took another 4 hours of careful, grinding pressure before Jordan finally cracked, and what came out of him was not the confession Torres had expected. It was something far stranger, and far more tragic. "I was with her," Jordan said, finally, his voice breaking in a way that, for the first time in the entire case, felt entirely unrehearsed. "I was with Bianca. By the pool. We were talking. We were finally talking, really talking, for the first time in months." According to Jordan, Bianca had confronted him that night, not about the affair with Priya, which she did not yet know about, but about the prenup, about his finances, about a creeping suspicion she'd been quietly developing for weeks that he loved her image more than he loved her. They had argued, then talked, then, somewhere around 1 in the morning, something had shifted between them, a real conversation, raw and unguarded, the kind neither of them had managed in months of curated dinners and staged engagement photos. Bianca had taken her evening medication earlier than usual that night, Jordan said, because she was anxious about the conversation, and by the time they finished talking, she was groggy, exhausted, ready to swim before bed the way she always did to relax, her wellness swim ritual, the one she swore helped her sleep. Jordan said he left her at the edge of the pool around 1:05 a.m., alive, tired, but alive, and went inside to give her space, assuming she would follow shortly after her swim. He did not check on her again until the screaming the next morning. He had lied about being asleep, he admitted, because he panicked, because he knew how it would look, a fiancée awake and alone with the victim in the final hour of her life, and because, in the chaos and grief of the days that followed, the lie had simply calcified into something he couldn't take back without making himself look guiltier than the truth ever would have. It was, Torres thought, listening to him fall apart across the table, either the most pathetic and convenient excuse she had heard in 15 years of homicide work, or it was true. And the maddening, infuriating truth of investigative work that the version of this story you've seen on television never quite captures honestly is that, very often, you don't get the luxury of knowing which one it is just from watching someone cry. What she did know was this: by Jordan's own account, he had left Bianca Sterling alive, alone, and drugged, at the edge of her own pool, at 1:05 a.m. And 9 minutes later, At 1:14 a.m., her sister Dahlia's gate code triggered an entry that was never matched by a recorded exit. Torres brought Dahlia back in for a second, far more pointed interview, and this time she didn't ease into it. "You said the front door was open when you arrived," Torres said. "You said there was a car you didn't recognize. Walk me through every single second between the moment you entered that gate and the moment you left, and don't leave anything out, because I now know your sister was alive 9 minutes before you arrived, and I need to know what happened to her in the time that you were inside the house." Dahlia's account, given this time without the protective vagueness of her first statement, was this: she had driven to the mansion that night on impulse, after 6 weeks of silence, fueled by a bottle of wine and a sudden, overwhelming wave of guilt about the photo she'd leaked and the relationship she'd let rot. She let herself in through the gate using a code she technically should no longer have had access to. Bianca had removed her from the financial accounts, but had apparently never thought to change the gate code, a small, human oversight that would end up mattering enormously. When she arrived, the house was quiet, mostly dark, except for soft lighting around the pool. She walked toward the back of the property, intending to find Bianca and finally, after weeks of rehearsing the words in her head, apologize. And that was when she saw it, her sister, in the water, not moving, the surface of the pool disturbingly still. "I thought she was floating on purpose," Dahlia said, her voice cracking. She did these float meditations sometimes, lying still in the water for 10 minutes at a time. "I called her name. She didn't answer. I got closer and I called her name again, and then I saw her face was under the water, and I—" Dahlia stopped, pressed her hand against her mouth, and for almost a full minute, could not continue. "I pulled her up," she finally said. "I pulled her head up out of the water and I screamed her name and I shook her and there was nothing, there was no response, her eyes were open and there was nothing behind them, and I have never been so afraid of anything in my entire life. And then I heard a car door, somewhere near the back drive, and I panicked. I thought, God, I don't even know what I thought. I thought someone was going to find me there with my dead sister and think I'd done it, after everything, after the photo, after she cut me off, who was going to believe I didn't do it? So I let go of her. I let her go back into the water and I ran. I ran out the side gate and I drove home and I have hated myself every single day since. It was a confession of cowardice, not murder, but it was also, Torres realized with a sick, sinking certainty, confirmation of something far more important than Dahlia herself understood. Bianca Sterling was already dead, or beyond saving, face down and unresponsive in that pool, before 1:14 a.m., meaning the window for the actual killing had narrowed down to the 9 minutes between Jordan leaving her alive at 1:05 and Dahlia finding her dead at 1:14. 9 minutes. And during those 9 minutes, according to every piece of evidence Torres had gathered, exactly one other person was confirmed to be on that property, Russell Pike, the disgraced ex-cop who claimed he didn't arrive until 12:50 a.m. and found her already in the pool. Except Pike had said he arrived at 12:50 and found her already dead. Dahlia's account proved Bianca was alive at 1:05 when Jordan left her. Which meant Russell Pike had lied about his timeline. And the only reason a man lies about exactly when he arrived somewhere is if he needs to hide what he was doing in the minutes he's trying to erase. Torres went back to Russell Pike a final time, armed now with the kind of contradiction that breaks even the most carefully rehearsed story, and laid it out for him without preamble. "You told me you arrived at 12:50 and found her already in the pool, already dead. But Bianca Sterling's own fiancé left her alive, talking, breathing, at 1:05 a.m., 15 minutes after you claim you found her body. Someone is lying, Russell, and right now, every piece of evidence I have says it's you." Pike's calm, for the first time in the entire investigation, finally broke. What came spilling out of him over the next 90 minutes was the final, ugly piece of the puzzle, the piece that turned this case from a tragic accident dressed up as murder into something far colder, far more deliberate, and far more damning for the men who had set the entire night into motion. Pike admitted he had lied about his arrival time. He had actually arrived closer to 1 a.m., not 12:50, and he had not simply stumbled upon a body already in the water. He had let himself into the pool house, intending to do exactly what Felix Marsh's instructions had described, search for physical files, documents, anything related to the forensic audit Bianca had requested, anything that could be removed and destroyed before that audit ever happened. He had been inside the pool house, rifling through a desk where Bianca sometimes kept printed records, when he heard voices outside, Bianca and Jordan, arguing, then talking, their voices carrying easily across the quiet of the night. He waited, hidden, for them to finish. He heard Jordan leave. And then, through the pool house window, he watched Bianca Sterling, drugged, exhausted, alone, ease herself into the water for her nightly swim, the same ritual she performed almost every night of her adult life. And Russell Pike, a man being paid by Felix Marsh to make a problem disappear, made a decision in that moment that he would later try, unconvincingly, to frame as opportunity rather than intent. "I didn't plan to hurt her," he said, his voice flat now, stripped of the calm performance from earlier. But she was right there. Alone. Already half asleep in the water. And I knew if that audit happened, Felix was finished, and I was finished too, because everything that firm had done for him over the past year, watching her, going through her things, all of it would come out. I just needed her to not wake up enough to finish that audit. I told myself I was just going to make sure she stayed under for a minute. Just long enough to scare her. Just long enough to lose some time. I told myself that the whole way across the pool deck. He did not finish the sentence the way a confession is supposed to end, with a clean admission of intent. He simply stopped talking and looked, for the first time since Torres had met him, genuinely, deeply afraid, not of the law, but of the truth of what he had actually done in those 9 minutes, a truth that even he, by his own account, had not fully let himself believe until he was already walking away from the water and Bianca Sterling had already stopped moving. Russell Pike's confession gave Torres a killer's hands, but it did not, on its own, give her the architect of the entire scheme, and Torres knew, the moment Pike finished talking, that the case would be incomplete, legally and morally, if it ended with only the man who had physically held Bianca Sterling under the water and not the man who had sent him there in the first place. Felix Marsh's lawyers fought the new charges for nearly 3 weeks, arguing that Pike's actions had been entirely his own, unsanctioned, unforeseeable, a rogue contractor exceeding the scope of legitimate corporate surveillance. It was a defense that might have held, were it not for one final piece of evidence Torres's team uncovered during a follow-up search of the surveillance firm's internal communications, a text message sent from Felix Marsh's personal phone to the surveillance firm's account manager at 11:52 p.m. the night of the murder, 8 minutes after the now infamous "Don't Answer" voicemail that had been recorded. Torres finally confirmed, from a burner phone Felix had purchased specifically to disguise his location, explaining the Santa Monica Tower ping that had initially seemed to clear him. The text read, in full, "Make sure tonight handles itself. I don't care how. This audit cannot happen, *." It was not, in isolation, an explicit order to kill anyone. Felix's lawyers would spend the better part of a year arguing exactly that point in court. But combined with the burner phone voicemail, the surveillance contract, Pike's dispatch to the property with instructions to prevent the removal of files, and the $12 million in documented embezzlement that the forensic audit would have exposed, the prosecution's case painted a portrait of a man who had not pulled the trigger himself, but who had built every single condition required for someone else to pull it for him, and who had sent that someone into Bianca Sterling's home on the one night that mattered most, with instructions vague enough to provide deniability and clear enough to be understood. Felix Marsh would eventually be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, securities fraud, and embezzlement, sentenced to a combined 31 years, a number that, his lawyers argued bitterly in their final appeal, would likely amount to a life sentence given his age. Russell Pike pled guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony against Felix, receiving a sentence of 18 years. Jordan Cole and Priya Anand, whose affair had once looked, in the earliest days of the investigation, like the obvious heart of this story, were never charged with anything beyond the lies they told investigators in the initial hours of the case, lies born, in the end, not of murder, but of two frightened, deeply flawed people trying to protect themselves from a tragedy they had not actually caused. And Dahlia Kowalski, the sister who had spent 6 weeks estranged from a woman she loved more than she had ever managed to say out loud, was never charged with anything at all, though she would later tell a reporter, in the only interview she ever agreed to give, that she did not believe any verdict, any sentence, any courtroom outcome would ever feel like justice, because the only thing she had actually wanted in those final 9 minutes was the chance to say she was sorry, and the water had taken that chance away before she'd even arrived. In the months following Bianca Sterling's death, Sterling Glow's parent company collapsed entirely, the IPO cancelled, the brand's name forever tied to scandal, fraud, and murder in a way no amount of rebranding could undo. The miracle serum that had quietly hospitalized at least 3 customers was permanently pulled from shelves, and a class action settlement, funded largely by what remained of Felix Marsh's seized assets, was distributed to the women he had knowingly continued to harm in pursuit of an IPO valuation he never lived to collect. But the video, the raw, unfiltered, unfinished confession Bianca had recorded alone in her bathroom 8 days before she died, the one she never had the chance to post, was eventually released, with the careful, grieving permission of her estate, 6 months after her death. It has since been viewed, at the time of this telling, more than 90 million times, far more than any polished tutorial or sponsored post she ever made while she was alive. People did not watch it because it was beautiful, or aspirational, or aesthetically perfect in the way her entire career had trained them to expect. They watched it because, for 3 minutes, the woman behind 11 million followers had finally let them see her without the glow, tired, scared, guilty, human, and had told them the truth right at the exact moment the truth was about to cost her everything. Detective Maya Torres, asked once by a journalist what she thought the case ultimately revealed, gave an answer that has stuck with everyone who has ever truly understood this story. She said that Bianca Sterling spent 10 years selling the world a version of perfection that did not exist, and that everyone around her, her fiancé, her best friend, her sister, the men who built her empire, had, in their own broken, human ways, tried to take a piece of that illusion for themselves, never once stopping to ask what it was actually costing the woman underneath it. And in the end, Torres said, the only person in that mansion who finally told the truth was the one person who never got the chance to say it out loud. Bianca Sterling is buried in a small cemetery outside the Ohio town she spent her entire career trying to leave behind, under a headstone that does not say Sterling at all. At her sister Dahlia's quiet insistence, one of the only requests the estate ever granted her, it reads simply, Bianca Kowalski. She was more than the glow, There is a strange, specific kind of grief that comes from mourning someone you never actually met, and in the weeks after Bianca Sterling's death, millions of strangers experienced it all at once, flooding her last posted video, a sunlit clip of her laughing in a kitchen, mixing a new highlighter shade that would never make it to shelves, with the same handful of words over and over, until the comment section read less like a memorial and more like a chorus. I feel like I lost a friend. She got me through my divorce. She taught me to love my face again, none of them knew, scrolling past those soft golden tones at 2 in the morning, that the woman who taught them to love their faces had not been able to look at her own without flinching for the better part of a decade. None of them knew that the glow they'd spent years trying to recreate in their own bathroom mirrors had been built, brushstroke by brushstroke, over a foundation of exhaustion, fear, and a hunger that fame had never once managed to satisfy. Torres kept a single printout from that comment section pinned to the inside of her case file for the entire length of the investigation, not because it offered any evidence, but because it captured, more honestly than any of the suspects ever managed in their interviews, exactly what had been lost. It was a comment from a woman in Nebraska, posted 4 hours after the news broke, that read, "She made me feel like I wasn't alone in a room by myself. I hope she knew how many rooms she was in." Torres never found out if Bianca ever read it. She suspected, by the end, that Bianca probably hadn't, that in the final frantic weeks of her life, buried under a forensic audit, a fraying engagement, a sister she'd cut off, and a confession she hadn't yet found the courage to post, the woman behind 11 million followers had been far too lonely, in the most literal sense of the word, to notice how many people loved her. That, perhaps, is the cruelest twist this story has to offer, crueler even than the 9 minutes by the pool, crueler than the burner phone or the embezzled millions or the affair that almost derailed the entire investigation. Bianca Sterling spent 10 years building a community of strangers who would have caught her, every single one of them, if she had only let herself fall in front of them instead of behind a locked bathroom door at 2 in the morning, alone, rehearsing a confession to a camera that would not see daylight until after she was already gone. She gave the world her glow because she believed, on some deep and unexamined level, that the glow was the only currency she had worth offering, and the people closest to her, the ones who were supposed to love the parts she kept hidden, spent her final months trying to take pieces of that currency for themselves instead of ever simply asking her how she was. Maybe that is the real reason this story has refused to fade the way most tabloid tragedies eventually do, the reason new viewers keep finding their way to her old videos years later, sitting up at night the way Bianca herself once did, watching a stranger's face and feeling, for a few minutes, less alone in a room by themselves. Not because of the murder, though the murder is what pulled the world's attention toward her in the first place. But because somewhere in the 4 minutes of raw, unfiltered footage she recorded and never had the chance to post, millions of strangers finally got to meet the actual woman behind 10 years of borrowed perfection, tired, frightened, guilty, brave in the last way that mattered, and recognized, with a kind of ache that doesn't fully go away, that she had been one of them the entire time. She just never let herself believe it until it was almost too late to matter. This has been Blush and Blood. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us, you know what to do, and we'll see you in the next one. End of script.